Very much, Orit. I'd also like to just start by thanking the organizers. I'm very happy to be here, and it's really wonderful to see old friends and mentors and also new friends. And I think I'll start with a confession. You know, Sami Zubaydah, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting yesterday, spoke so wonderfully about the cinema. And you know, my topic is the same, but I'm afraid I'm not as funny as him, and I also definitely haven't memorized as many of the songs as he has, but I'll try to do my best. So I'll start with a little detour. The Palestinian intellectual and novelist Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, who spent a large part of his life in Baghdad, wrote a novel about Baghdad's thriving cultural and intellectual scene in the 40s and 50s. Hunters in a Narrow Street, as the novel is called, is in many ways about leisure. Before arriving in Baghdad, the novel's protagonist asks around to get a better sense of the city, and I quote, "And was Baghdad a big city?" I had asked someone in Damascus. "It certainly is," came the answer. "There are 14 cabarets in it." After his arrival in Baghdad, the protagonist asks an employee at his hotel about sightseeing recommendations. "This is my first day here. Are there interesting places to see?" "Loads. There are cinemas and cafes." "No, I mean, I just didn't know how to put it to him." "I see, you mean cabarets where you can have fun. Just go down this way to Southgate," end of quote. Hunters in a Narrow Street does not specifically deal with Jewish life or leisure in Iraq. However, the fact that cafes, cinemas, and cabarets are mentioned as the most important landmarks of Baghdad shows the extent to which Baghdad's urban modernity was understood and often narrated through its venues of leisure. And this is no coincidence. In the first half of the 20th century, Baghdad was quickly becoming an Arab cultural capital. As part of this process, a wide array of leisure venues and practices, both old and new, was available to Baghdadis. Leisure intersects with the politics of culture, gender, class, and ethnicity. Therefore, I believe that a study of leisure has the potential to open up unexplored sources of information on much wider issues. And so today, with a particular focus on leisure in Baghdad, my paper will try to offer an alternative and inclusive portrayal of modernity and Jewish life in Iraq. I take as my point of departure the notion or the idea that leisure both defined and expressed key aspects of Iraqi, Baghdadi, and therefore also Iraqi Jewish modernity. Similarly, I believe that looking closely at leisure can complicate sectarian-based approaches to the Iraqi national landscape and perhaps show the mixed nature of the imagined space of the nation and the lived spaces of the city. Iraqi Jews were active as both producers and consumers of leisure in a wide range of industries, but today I'll focus on the cinema. The cinema is a prime example of a modern form of leisure in which Iraqi Jews not only played a part or took part on all levels, but also played a pioneering and dominant role right from the inception of the cinema industry. In the longer version of this paper, I focus on a number of leisure sites such as the theater, the Tigris River, the cafe, and Jewish-owned nightclubs and cafes, but we can talk more about that during the Q&A. Today, my focus is on the cinema. To understand the important role that Iraqi Jews came to play within the world of leisure, it's necessary to briefly sketch out some of the key developments and transformations that took part in Iraq in the 20th century. In the last year of Ottoman rule, during the Mandate and the years of the Hashemite period, the city of Baghdad was transforming from a regional Ottoman city to a fast-growing capital. The city witnessed the establishment of modern streets with electrical lighting, new neighborhoods, suburbs, new forms of transportation, state and bureaucratic institutions, and an influx of immigrants from rural parts of the country. The most illustrative example is perhaps Rashid Street, Baghdad's modern thoroughfare. It was officially opened in 1916 and became one of the city's main commercial, retail, and entertainment hubs, and most of the early cinemas were also located there. Baghdad's urban transformation added new forms of leisure to already existing ones. In fact, as the city grew, so did the opportunities for leisure. And as a general trend, modern leisure and entertainment moved from the private realm, and were transformed into public activities that often took place and were organized on a commercial scale. Iraqi Jews eagerly took part in the city's new leisurely offers. They did so as producers, investors, merchants, and workers. At the same time, they became consumers and contributors to Iraqi leisure. Professor Baskin's important work has shown how many Iraqi Jews educated in both Jewish and non-Jewish schools were Arabized through their education during the Hashemite period. This facilitated their participation in the Iraqi National Project and allowed them to take part in Iraq's modern Arabic urban culture, as well as in the country's political, economic, and intellectual life. This was in many ways reflected in the leisure practices of the members of the new Jewish middle and middling classes who began to spend more time outside of their religious community. Iraqi Jewish men and young boys, and to a lesser degree, women, girls, and families frequented Baghdad's many cinemas, concert halls, theaters, and cafes. Participation in organized sports also increased, and Jewish fitness clubs and organizations appeared. Iraqi Jews also took part in the city's literary life. They visited literary salons and libraries, wrote fiction and poetry, and contributed to newspapers, journals, and magazines. The wealthier members of the Jewish community frequented private spaces such as social and country clubs. The Alwiya Club, created by the British, is one example. Like Muslims and Christians, Iraqi Jews also frequented Baghdad's nocturnal venues of leisure, such as bars, nightclubs, cabarets, casinos, and more illicit ones, such as brothels. The cinema in Iraq was an extremely popular place of leisure. Like other places in the region, the cinema very quickly became an established form of urban entertainment and life. In addition, the cinema was one of the most important cultural platforms that connected Iraq to places across the region and the globe, both through the screen and the economic networks and companies that brought films to Iraq. And here, Iraqi Jews played a very pioneering role on all levels. On the evening of July 26, 1909, the first silent film was shown in Baghdad. The film was shown outdoors, and the spectacle of the moving image and the relatively cool Baghdad summer night combined to attract a large audience. The event took place outside in the Karkh area of Baghdad. 2 years later, in 1911, this place became known as the Cinema Baluki, named after the Jewish merchant who imported the equipment and the films. Baluki only showed silent films, most of which were imported from Britain or France. The program at Baluki was changed every Friday, and most of Baghdad's first cinemas, like Baluki, were in fact open-air cinemas, and later on, permanent cinemas also added open-air cinemas for the summer months. Since the first screening at Cinema Baluki, Iraqi Jews played an important role in the cinema industry, mostly, I think, due to their connections abroad and familiarity with foreign languages. The large public interest in cinema, combined with the promise of economic profit, seems to have been the main motivator driving forward the industry, which remained on private hands until the mid or even late 60s. Initially, it was in the import of foreign movies and construction of cinemas that Iraqi Jews played the most important role. In 1920, a Jewish merchant established Cinema Central in the Hafiz al-Qadi area of Rashid Street. Cinema Central later changed its name to Rafidain. And it was owned by the Jewish Dodi family and is considered one of the first real cinemas in Iraq. In the 30s and 40s, many more cinemas appeared across the city. Cinema Royale opened in the Bab al-Agha area, Cinema al-Iraqi in the Midan area, and Al-Rashid Cinema and Al-Sawra on Al-Rashid Street. Most of these and several others like Al-Watani and Crown were owned by Jews. In 1937, the two Jewish brothers, Shaul and Kamil Qubi, built Cinema Ghazi in the Bab al-Sharqi area. You have a Cinema Ghazi. Together with Cinema al-Sawra, Cinema Ghazi became known as one of the most fanciest and luxurious cinemas in Baghdad, and was also one of the first to install AC. I know anecdotally that al-Sawra was featured on an Iraqi postal stamp, but I haven't been able to find this, so if anyone knows, I'd love to hear from them. Outside of Baghdad, only one cinema by the name of Al-Rashid and Basra was owned by Jews. It was owned by the Saudai family, also mentioned by Sami yesterday, the most important Jewish family in Iraqi cinema. Esra Saudai and his three brothers also started the Columbia Company, which later changed its name to the Iraqi Company for Films. The company specialized in the import of American movies and also owned several of the most famous cinemas in Baghdad, including Roxy, Broadway, Cinema Baghdad, Metro, and Cinema Al-Rashid. In 1934, 4 Iraqi Jews, the names of whom I've not been able to find, started another company called the Baghdadi Cinema Company. Some cinemas and import companies were joint business ventures between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The industrious Saudai family mentioned earlier also established the production company Studio Baghdad in 1946. And the quality is very bad, but this is the logo of Studio Baghdad. They did so in partnership with the Christian Messiah family, who owned one of the Arak distilleries in Iraq, and a Muslim business partner and another Iraqi Jew by the name of Salman Silkha. There's some anecdotal evidence that Studio Baghdad in 48 was accused of being a Zionist spy then, but the year later in 49, the Iraqi police actually hired Studio Baghdad to make a documentary about them. In 1954, Studio Baghdad was sold to Iraqis living abroad, but continued to make films until 66, which in that year was sold to the Coca-Cola company, who bought the buildings and built a factory there. In the 1940s, the Saudai family began construction of Medina Roxy City on Al-Rashid Street. This complex included not only Cinema Roxy, but also the Rex nightclub, the Roxy Casino, and 2 outdoor cinemas. And here's the Roxy Summer Outdoor Cinema. In addition, several shops selling sandwiches, snacks, and beverages were added to the complex. Such shops were often found in the vicinity of cinemas and were the busiest before the start of the movie and during intermission. The Roxy Summer Nightclub, which was also part of the complex, hosted performances with Egyptian singers such as Hassan al-Malwani and Hafsa Helmi. It was later changed into a bar. The Rex nightclub became the Rex Cinema. And I think this complex of Medina Roxy, or Roxy City, demonstrates several important points. Firstly, it shows that Iraqi Jews were involved and quite literally invested in the broad geography of leisure in Baghdad that extended beyond the cinema. Secondly, it tells us something interesting about how different sites and forms of leisure often intersect and overlap. In the case of Roxy City, the cinema became actively engaged with the surrounding social and economic environment, both through advertisements, snack shops, and other venues of leisure. You know, here we have a picture from outside, and you know, the cinema in some ways also changed the surrounding streets through its advertisement. Last but not least, the commercial complex of Roxy City, I think, or I could perhaps argue, is an early example of the capitalist structures that increasingly came to organize leisure in Baghdad. Moreover, Roxy City, I believe, also allows us to perhaps trace the beginnings of a middle-class desire for public, yet semi-private and exclusive spaces of leisure. In the 1930s, there were attempts to produce Iraqi films. None of these, however, materialized until the 40s. In the Iraqi Arabic scholarship, there's been much debate about what can rightly be called the first Iraqi film. There can be no doubt, however, that Alia Waissam from 1948 was one of the first. Studio Baghdad, owned by the Saudai brothers, produced the film. The songs and the script were written by the Iraqi Jewish lawyer, journalist, poet, and editor, Anwar Shaul. Being a poet, Shaul initially wrote the script in metered and rhymed verse, but was asked to rewrite it since the owners of the studio found that it was too formal. The Al-Kuwaiti brothers, who I'm sure we'll hear much more about later today or tomorrow, composed the music. And here's a scene from the film. Alia Waissam was directed by a French director and with French equipment. The actors, however, were Iraqi and came mostly from the theater. Salima Murad also featured in the movie. I won't describe the movie in detail here, but it's a Romeo and Juliet-like story about a prince and a princess from 2 warring Iraqi tribes and revenge. It ends with the tragic suicide of both of the protagonists. Sorry for the spoiler, but you know. In 1952, Studio Baghdad also produced the film Layla fil Iraq in partnership with the Jewish Danos family who owned Cinema Sawra. So Leaving the world of production behind, I want to say a few words about the cinema as a space of experience and consumption of leisure. The majority of Iraqi Jews' memoirs and autobiographies, whether written in Arabic, Hebrew, English, or French, contain fond memories of going to the cinema. This does not mean, of course, that the cinema was a uniquely Jewish space. While Iraqi Jews dominated the industry in terms of production, business, and ownership, the cinema was a space in which Iraqis, regardless of religion, gathered to be entertained, transported, and thrilled by the magic of the screen. In his memoir, Memoirs of Baghdad Childhood, Victor Sassoon devotes many pages to experiences in Baghdad cinemas, and I quote, "The cinema was a great attraction to me as a child, as a teenager. It opened the gates to new, different, and exciting worlds, real or imaginary. Thinking back to my boyhood years, I'm still mystified as to my keen interest in films and film stars. Why was I such an addict to films? I believe my imagination broadened, and the more I saw, the more I wanted to see." The cinema was also where Sassoon had his first encounters with the opposite sex. His school was not co-educational, but, and I quote, "The cinema, and especially American films that showed actresses with scant clothing, opened one's eyes a bit. Betty Hutton and Betty Grable, or some female dancer scantily dressed, titillated the imagination a little." At the age of 12, Sassoon was allowed to visit the cinema on his own. He preferred Roxy, Al-Sawra, Al-Hamra, and Al-Rafidain, all on Al-Rashid Street. Like many other Iraqi boys, Sassoon was a fan of Tarzan movies. And I quote, "Tarzan films were naturally a staple for Baghdadi Jewish boys. Was there a boy in Baghdad who did not like Tarzan? Was there a child who did not relish his incredible feats against the villains of this world? Johnny Weissmuller and his monkey offered exciting adventure and humor at the same time." End of quote. He also loved the adventure, action, and excitement of the Zorro and Flash Gordon movies. But Sassoon also had a keen musical ear, and the cinema was where he was first introduced to the songs and compositions of Muhammad Abdul Wahab, who he continued to listen to also later in life. Initially, the experience of the cinema was mostly shared by boys and men. Some cinemas, however, like Rafidain, offered gender-segregated screenings several times a week. While the cinema increasingly became both class and gender inclusive, it remained, like most other forms of leisure, a classed space. Not everyone had equal access to the cinema. Free time and money to spend on tickets were prerequisites. A Jewish student at the elite American Jesuit Baghdad College wrote an essay in the school yearbook about a young boy's struggle to come up with the necessary funds to go to the cinema. And I quote, "Jim," all the names in these essays are American. "Jim liked to see cinemas, but he found it very hard to see as many as he wished. The difficulty was money. Getting cinema money week after week was the most pressing problem of his life." Jim, however, was lucky and always found a way to convince his mother to pay for tickets. Nassim Rajwan, who spent his youth in Baghdad, was also an avid moviegoer in his youth. Fortunately for Rajwan, his aunt had married a wealthy Jewish merchant who owned part of Cinema Royale. In his memoir, Rajwan describes how he used to loiter in front of Royale before the start of the film. If the cinema wasn't full, one of the employees, almost all relatives of the owner, would let him in. Later in life, Rajwan contributed to the growing culture that surrounded the cinema by writing film criticism and reviews for the English language and pro-British The Times of Iraq. He received a free pass to Baghdad cinemas and wrote up to 4 reviews a week. The late Sassoon Sommer describes in his memoir, Baghdad et Mon, how he too received a free journalist pass in the 40s when he worked as a film critic for the El Nadim magazine. Victor Sassoon, mentioned earlier, describes how he would usually go to the cinema on Saturday afternoons after his father had recited the blessings for the Shabbat. Sassoon's older brother gave him a weekly allowance of 100 fils, which he spent almost entirely on tickets. The cheapest tickets cost 40 fils, which allowed Sassoon to watch 2 movies a week and still have a little money left for snacks. Iraqi government statistics from the 50s, and I regret that I don't have the statistics from earlier years, but from the 50s, show that the average middle-class family of 7 spent around 231 fils on movie tickets every month. Not everyone, however, was as lucky as Jim, Nassim Rajwan, Victor Sassoon, and Sasson Somekh. And it's safe to assume that poor families spend significantly less on entertainment and leisure. Even for those lucky enough to afford tickets, the cinema remained a classed space. This manifested in the architecture of the cinema. The cheapest tickets, as I mentioned, cost 40 fils and gave access to seats on the ground floor. These tickets were normally only purchased by boys and young men and were colloquially referred to as Abul Arbain. A seat on the upper level went for 70 fils. Private loges, which lined the upper balcony in most cinemas, were the most expensive and were usually reserved by wealthier families and couples. The loges were also popular with couples, as I said, and lovers. Some loges could be locked from the inside, which provided a level of privacy not easily found elsewhere, for those who could afford it, of course. The phenomenon of romantic encounters in the cinema was popularized in Iraqi maqam performances during the time, and the following line in particular gained fame. للسلمى أوديج باللوج أقعدج من القص والبوس والله أشعبج. Shabaj, okay, afwan, my Iraqi is not so good, but in English, I'll take you to the cinema, seat you in the lodge, and with pinches and kisses, I swear I will appease your appetite. It's always nice to end a paper on a note about romance, so I'll try to do that, but sadly, we all know that the story of Iraqi Jews did not end exactly that way. After 1950-51, only 4 cinemas remained in the hands of Jews: Al-Rashid, Roxy, Al-Zawra, and Al-Khayyam. Eventually, Iraqi Jews disappeared from the country's cinema industry and cinema halls. Perhaps because of their departure was so sudden, the country's cinema industry, their pioneering role in the cinema has not been properly recognized. I hope that my paper has been a very small contribution. However, there's still a lot of work that has to be done. And I'm very honored by the opportunity to ask this very unique gathering of people for thoughts and ideas or comments or corrections, but thank you for listening.